It's time now for World Watchers International with Mae Brussell, who for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
No, this isn't Mae. This is Bill Kaysing, and I'm going to be her guest this evening, and she'll be back with you next week. Now, for those of you that are recording this broadcast, this is number 471, January 18th, 1981, and this is side one for the tape cassettes. Well, I'll introduce myself. My name is Bill Kaysing. I'm a freelance writer, and for about the past 7 years, I've been investigating what I consider is a massive conspiracy, that of the fact that we didn't really send men to the moon. My claim is that the Apollo adventures were simply a gigantic $30 billion hoax. I've written a book about it called We Never Went to the Moon, and that's what we're going to get into this evening. Now, we've got a message here from Mae. She reports that John Weir, technologist and engineer for the Hughes organization, held a press conference in Vancouver, British Columbia this week. Meir stated three things that have now been covered in the Vancouver, BC newspapers. One, Howard Hughes is not buried in Texas. The Howard Hughes organization later named Summa Corporation, which includes the Hughes Aircraft Company and the Hughes Medical Institute, and claimed that it's nothing but a cover for the CIA. In fact, it is the CIA. And three, the CIA works illegally in Canada. And as Mae says, she published an article for Playgirl called Is Howard Hughes Dead and Buried Off a Greek Island? In 1976, on Good Morning America with Robert Hartman, she reported the same message. She stated that Vance Cooper is buried in that unmarked grave in Texas. Now, next week, Mae is going to go into the Hughes hoax with you, the meaning of this massive deception. And now we're going to get back to myself and the moon hoax. Most people, when they're interested in what I have to say, ask me when I got started on the moon hoax. And I began this study in 1974 when I was living on my boat, and some people wanted to know what I thought about the government. In essence, what was my real opinion? And I said, well, my feeling was that the government itself was a gigantic hoax. And someone popped up and they said, well, Bill, you were in the space program. Do you think that we really went to the moon? And I said, no, I really don't think so. And so then they said, why don't you write a book about it? And I said, that's a good idea. And I more or less did it as a spoof. So I sat down and I wrote an outline and I sent it off to a publisher, and sure enough, I got a contract back, and I went off to Las Vegas to write the book. And in the process of writing the book, I began to uncover things that just weren't right. For example, I discovered that a man by the name of Thomas Ronald Barron had been employed by North American Aviation. And he was very, very, let's say, diligent about his work, and he kept a record of everything that went wrong with the Apollo program. And after the three astronauts were burned to death in 1967, he came before a congressional investigating committee and testified that the whole Apollo project was simply a big scam. And in so doing, he got himself killed. About 3 days after he testified, he was found dead in his automobile at a railway crossing. What I'd like to do now for the rest of the broadcast, since I work best on sort of a dialogue basis, is more or less have questions asked to me by the various people in the studio. We have Matthew here, Roger, who is a DJ, and I'm going to let him start off to sort of play devil's advocate with me and ask me questions about the moon hoax. Roger?
Well, I think the the first thing that pops into my head is probably the most general question, that the covering up something as massive as the United States' supposed landing on the moon seems to me a project almost as difficult as landing on the moon to begin with. How could something like this have been kept such a closely guarded secret? I mean, the entire country was involved.
That's a very, very good question. And, I've actually thought about that many, many times. I've wondered, why would they pull a hoax off when it would be almost as easy to just go to the moon? But here's the thing. Having spent time in the aerospace industry, I know that at the time that they wanted to go to the moon, it was technically impossible. In other words, the technology to actually send men to the moon hadn't been developed. So they really had no choice. They simply had to fake it. So they did the best they could in faking it. But as I point out in my book, they left a lot of things that were sort of unanswered. And I think I left you some questions there if you'd like to ask some of those.
Well, let's see here. Yeah, there's some very interesting questions here. For instance, the moon rocks, which I was fascinated by. Why were the moon rocks rushed to Switzerland right after they landed? What proof is there that they are actually rocks from the moon? That is interesting. All right. We have a minor difficulty. If we could, you think maybe you're not feeling well. You think maybe we should take a break?
I think there's a very little air in here. Yeah,
all right.
We'll take a little break.
All right. Matthew, how about some music to fill up the interim?
Just a little bit of thought and effort will help save many gallons of water in your home. Take shorter showers, or take a bath using a partially filled tub. Don't use the toilet as a wastebasket. Don't let the water run while brushing your teeth or while washing vegetables or dishes. A message from your Monterey Peninsula Water Management District.
KLRB, Carmel by the Sea.
Explain to the audience that every Sunday I have a fast and to cleanse my system, and apparently it left me just a little bit weak and underpowered, and when I walked into the studio it was very warm in here, and a combination of no food and a warm room just kind of did it to me. So anyway, I'm back here talking to Roger, and the usual way that I present my program is in a dialogue form. In other words, I seem to respond best when someone acts as a devil's advocate. In other words, challenges me, just as he did a moment ago when he said, wasn't it as difficult to pull off the moon hoax as it was to actually go to the moon? And then, of course, I went on to explain that technically they couldn't do it. They simply had to fake it. So I'll bounce back to Roger again and field another question from him.
Well, I was going to ask about the moon rocks. As a matter of fact, I did. But on going back to the first comment, that, in other words, you feel that it was done, the hoax was perpetrated to avoid losing face, that we had to match the Russians, or, I mean, granted, all right, if we didn't have the technology to do it, why didn't we just say so and drop the whole thing? Why was it necessary to continue with the hoax?
That's a very good question. In fact, that's one that I'm most commonly asked by moderators when I do the radio and TV broadcast. The reason that we had to go ahead with a hoax was this. First of all, President Kennedy more or less committed the United States to go to the moon within about a 10-year period. He said, before the end of the decade, we will land men on the moon. Now, by making that commitment, he more or less committed all of American technology, our expertise. And remember that since America is is governed and controlled and manipulated and ruled by these giant corporations. They did not want to appear second best. They certainly didn't want to take 12 years to get to the moon, or 15 years. They wanted to do it within the time schedule. In addition, there was what I claim it was a phony race between America and Russia in trying to get to the moon by the end of the decade. Actually, my research has indicated that the Russians never entertained the idea of landing men on the moon because in 1954 they did some studies that revealed that the surface of the moon is so heavily assailed with cosmic radiation, solar radiation, temperature extremes, micrometeorites, that a human being to survive there would need a spacesuit made of solid lead about 3 feet thick, or he'd die. So I would say generally that what we're looking at is the fact that we had to do something by the end of the 60s. We had committed ourselves. American technological prestige was at stake, and there was no way that they could weasel out of it. In other words, they were committed. They had to do it.
All right. Going back to the moon suits and so forth. Now, as I recall, at the turn of the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, with the advent of the automobile and so on and so forth, there were a number of very well-respected people who said that man could not survive speeds in excess of 30 miles an hour because the blood would be dragged to the back of his head and he would die. Now, isn't it possible that our idea of the dangers and the hazards of the surface of the moon were something along the same line, that we simply were guessing where we didn't really know yet?
Well, that's possible, but then again, considering that they were able to land Surveyor on the moon, I don't question that achievement. Prior to the alleged moon landings, they did drop a couple of Surveyor instrumented what would you call it, mechanical reporting units on the surface of the moon. And it's my belief that these units merely substantiated the Russian discoveries that the lunar surface was lethal to a human being. So that I think your point is well taken, Roger, that landing on the moon may have been analogous to this we can't go more than 30 miles an hour or else we die sort of thing. But on the other hand, I think that that the Russian studies, corroborated by the Surveyor broadcasts back to Earth, would pretty much substantiate my contention that the lunar surface really is lethal, and much more protection would have been needed. For example, micrometeorites hitting the surface of the moon at 30,000 miles per hour. Any one of these would have punctured not only the suit, but it would have gone right through the astronauts and killed them.
The conditions you've stated for the lethal nature of the surface of the moon would seem to apply also to the conditions found in open space between between planetary objects. Are you contending then that we never have left the atmosphere of the planet, that the extravehicular activity in orbit we saw was also faked?
Well, I have sort of mixed feelings about that, Roger. I have a friend who claims that we never even orbited the Earth. In other words, that even John Glenn and Grissom and Shepard and so forth actually never did orbit because of the danger of micrometeorites and because of cosmic radiation. And just a tremendous dangers fraught that are fraught in any environment other than our own terrestrial one. There's a very interesting point that could be brought up here, and that is that a man by the name of Lloyd Mallon was more or less doing the same thing I've been doing towards NASA, only he was doing it toward the Russian space exploits. And he proved back in the late 60s, in fact, 2 articles were published in a national magazine claiming that the Russians never really orbited the Earth, that Yuri Gagarin and others actually, those were total fakes. And he proved this by means of analyzing Russian space photography and Russian reports. And it's interesting to note that Malin died of cancer in 1973, and it's my feeling that at that time he was beginning to analyze too diligently and too carefully the American exploits. And maybe he got a little bit too much radiation one of those times. Who knows?
On the subject of photography, going through some of the information you've given me here, that you make a very strong point that in all the photographs of the lunar surface and the vehicles in transit and so forth, all of the pictures taken in space or basically in space show no stars in the night sky. That, as you pointed out to me earlier,
right,
that without the atmosphere of the Earth to blanket out and dim these stars, it would be a very brilliant show, and it's unusual that none of the photographs show that. Maybe you could...
Yeah, I'd like to dwell on that, because I tell you, I think, Roger, that's one of the most important points I have. Take, for example, the moment when Neil Armstrong actually, or allegedly, as I claim, stepped out of the lunar module. Now, his first comment, of course, was, "This is one small step for man and a great leap for mankind." Shortly after that, he began talking about the surface of the moon. Now, my feeling is that when he stepped down on the moon's surface and looked up at the sky, in other words, the universe, he would have been absolutely, amazed at the beauty of billions of stars shining with an intensity unknown on Earth. The only time we get anything even close to that is when we're out in the desert, far from any cities, and we see the Milky Way blazing in the sky, and we see the planets, all the celestial bodies, without much haze or interference. But imagine on the moon, where there is no atmosphere, these stars would shine without any wavering, without any glittering. In other words, they wouldn't twinkle. They would simply appear like locomotive headlights, just glaring down, billions, trillions of them. The far distant galaxies, would just glow. The nebula would appear. And, of course, consider, too, that Saturn, Jupiter, the large planets would have been very visible. The rings of Saturn, for example, would have been visible. And yet not one astronaut in all of the alleged 6 voyages to the moon has ever commented on the beauty of the universe. Now that, to me, is a very, very strong point. Plus, and here's my clincher for that, why, when they claimed that they went to the moon and they took all kinds of equipment along, why didn't they take a camera setup and get the most magnificent photographs of the universe that could ever have been obtained?
That is an interesting point. You must have fielded these same questions to NASA officials or to somebody who should be in the know. Did they have any sort of answers for these questions?
Well, so many people have heard my broadcasts and have written NASA that NASA, I think in 1977, they prepared a 4-page mimeographed handout that answers a couple of the questions that I have posed to NASA. But as far as answering, for example, the question that I just posed, why didn't the astronauts comment on the stars and why didn't they take magnificent photos, they've never bothered to answer those kind of questions at all. There's a dead silence when I pose questions like, why didn't the lunar module engine carve out a crater, a significant crater below the rocket motor thrust chamber when it landed on the moon? In none of the pictures of the lunar module on the moon is there any evidence whatsoever that the engine was emitting this 30,000-pound thrust jet blast to blast away all of the loose sand and dirt. The surface of the moon is supposed to be so loose that a footprint shows up very clearly. Well, with that kind of loose sand, certainly the jet blast, which is far greater, well, maybe not greater, but certainly the equivalent of the jet blast from, say, a 747, why wouldn't it have blasted the sand and lunar dust away from the landing site below the engine? I feel that's
that is an interesting point. That you've got some great photographs here. Too bad we're not on television. That show exactly what you're talking about. The surface beneath the module is totally flat and seemingly undisturbed. That is interesting. And I was going to be an astronaut when I was a kid, too.
Yeah, here's another shot here. I'm showing one here to Roger that allegedly...
Just peek over my shoulder, you know.
Okay. This allegedly shows Colonel Aldrin on the moon, and in the background is the lunar module, and the motor thrust chamber is plainly in view, and there's no interruption or disruption of the surface of the moon below the engine whatsoever. And yet their footprints show very, very clearly in all the other photographs.
Yes. All right. What about some of the other evidences they brought back? The moon rocks. What did happen to the moon rocks? Where are they, and what was done with them?
Well, that's an excellent question, too. I always say that they really only have three modes of proof. The alleged photographs, the moon rocks, and, of course, the statements of the astronauts. Nothing else really is of any significant proof. The rocks, I claim, did not come from the moon. They were manufactured on Earth in a NASA ceramics laboratory where they can get temperatures up to molten rock. And they could have very easily created almost any type of mineral, any shape, size, any appearance. And since no one else has ever seen a moon rock, how possibly could anybody say these are authentic or these are not authentic? I mean, I can't, you can't, no scientist can. And yet, of course, we have photographs of moon rocks, and allegedly there are moon rock samples available to scientists, but who knows? That's a great mystery that certainly bears further investigation.
Well, it seems to me, I was reading an article in, I believe, Omni magazine not too long ago, that some of the moon rocks have been lost. Some of them are still in storage, right. And some of them have been stored they were sent to various institutions to be studied, but have never been taken out of storage. They're locked away, and I believe they're sealed in nitrogen or something of the sort.
Right.
And never have been shown. That is interesting. You make another comment here, if I can find it, about the mention of, or rather the lack of mention of gold, silver, diamonds, and other precious metals and minerals on the moon. That I had assumed that the possibility of mining the moon and seeking this out as to replenish our fading natural resources was one of the major reasons for going. Why was no mention ever made of this?
Well, of course, my claim is, since they didn't go to the moon, they really had nothing to report, and they didn't even dare to hypothesize, let's say, the existence of precious stones such as diamonds, or perhaps the existence of gold. In other words, Roger, what we're looking at is minimal information. Minimal photography. In other words, just enough to get by, just enough to try to prove their case to the great mass of people who will accept photographs and rocks as being the gospel. But beyond that, there's really very little information. We can get into a little bit more of that as soon as we flip sides on the tape. We're going to take a little break now so that the people who are recording this can flip their cassettes over. So I'll turn this back to Matthew for a moment.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with Mae Brussell. We will return with the second half after a brief pause.
I'm so
Let's see. I've been perusing a list of questions and things that have been posed here. This one's interesting. Why were all transmissions to be... I can almost read it. Why were all transmissions to be public via radio and television? Why were they were easily faked? Is that the contention here?
That's right, exactly. I found out something very interesting about the communications from the moon. First of all, they were all made at the gigahertz level, which is far beyond amateur radio operator capability. In addition, every transmission that allegedly came from the moon, that came into Goldstone or to Woomera, the various inputs all over the Earth that received the alleged messages from the moon, all of these inputs were then transmitted by other means to Goddard Space Center in Washington. Now, my contention is that that gave them the perfect excuse to create whatever they wanted to create and have it originate from Goddard, because from Goddard there was a leased telephone wire that went to, of course, Houston, to the Manned Space Flight Center in Houston, and that is, of course, where everything ended up. So, in other words, it was the easiest thing in the world for them to fake any type of transmission from the moon, because everything had to go through Goddard. Well, this, to me, meant that everything originated at Goddard. That nothing really originated from the moon. Let's take, for example, Roger, that famous telephone call between Aldrin and Armstrong on the moon, allegedly on the moon, and President Nixon on Earth. I've listened to that broadcast, and to me it just sounds like a hokey hoax. Because here you have two people chatting back and forth 250,000 miles, when most people that are involved with radio know that it's very, very difficult sometimes to get, say, a transmission from an airplane 30 miles away from, say, Washington, D.C. airport into the airport. And it's as though, you know, they were almost spoofing the public, having this conversation back and forth. I think that's almost ludicrous. And of course, on top of that, we all know Nixon's reputation as far as reliability.
Yeah, that was what struck me as you were saying that. But not wanting to jump on Mr. Nixon, at least I don't personally. The other effects, the television transmissions. Now, obviously, these all could have originated at Goddard. Is that what you
right?
Yes,
yeah,
right.
I claim that Goddard was the source for most of the communications.
Where did NASA get the? Now we're talking about a different kind of technology, but technology is definitely involved in what is known as special effects these days, and we've seen a lot of special effects in the movies lately. But this was quite some time ago. Where did NASA get the special effects expertise at this point in time?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. I found out that in 1965, while Stan Kubrick was making the film 2001, that his budget for special effects was mysteriously increased from $6 million to $11 million. And it's my contention that that money came from NASA. And he was given instructions to create the kind of special effects that could later be used to create the moon photographs, both still and motion picture. When you think about it, 2001 also served another purpose. It sort of manipulated and bamboozled the public into accepting motion pictures concerned with space, so that when the alleged moon landings finally took place, they would think, well, they can do it on the movies, but this is reality. In other words, it was a way of confusing the public, which is what our government really is very, very good at. And incidentally, before I forget this, I might forget this later on in the evening, there will be a new edition of this book to be published by Desert Publications in Cornville, Arizona. And I have the zip code here. It's 86325. Now, I don't know what the price of the book is going to be, but it's my understanding that it'll be available in March. So if anybody would like to get a copy of the book, just write Desert Publications, Cornville, Arizona, and that's 86325. So, Larry Moore, I've done my duty as far as...
we are talking about your book.
Yeah, that's true. Okay.
All right. While I was sitting there listening to you, I totally forgot what I was going to say. All right, why were the first astronauts held in quarantine? It's English, I should be able to read it. Why were they held in quarantine so long after their first trip?
That's a very good point. My contention is that the astronauts were really Manchurian candidates, that they were alternately drugged and hypnotized and brainwashed into actually thinking that what they were doing was they were going to simulate the moon landing. I think they knew this. I think they were aware of this. But the one problem that they would have had they been exposed to the press as soon as they got back from their alleged trip to the moon, if the press had been turned loose on these, particularly on Aldrin and Armstrong, the first, moon hoaxers, they probably would have been blown away by these questions. But when you think about it, if they had a 30-day cooling off period in which, sort of a debriefing, you might call it, in which to talk to some of the psychologists that were prepping them into what to say and so forth, then it gave them an opportunity to sort of get their act together so that when they did go into press conferences, they felt more comfortable. Now, here's the interesting thing. When Aldrin and Armstrong came back, it was documented by NASA that at no time were they afflicted or affected by any germs on the moon. So my question to NASA is this. If the first trip to the moon proved that the moon is a lifeless planet, why then were the other astronauts put into quarantine on their return? In other words, if the moon was dead and harmless to mankind, why bother? But my contention again is that they needed to have this debriefing, this cooling off period for 30 days in order to get their act together, to get their story straight and so forth before they had to submit themselves to the interrogation of the press.
Well, since I've been shanghaied here to play devil's advocate, wouldn't a possible explanation, now granted, they've decided that there is no native life on the moon, but you've already made mention of the cosmic radiation, or rather the gamma radiation, that is so prevalent in airless space once you get beyond the shield of the atmosphere, that any human body carries microorganisms and bacterium, etc., no matter, even if they've been kept in a relatively stable environment for some time prior.
Sure.
That couldn't it simply have been the fear of possible mutation, or simply the idea that they don't know what happens to the microorganisms that man carries around with him? Wouldn't that account for the quarantine?
That's a very good point. That's an excellent point, and I'm going to take that into consideration. I'm in the process of adding to this book constantly. What you're saying then, Roger, is that man taking, if they had indeed gone to the moon, if he took microorganisms to the moon, that they could have gone through mutation, through cosmic radiation, and then returned with something that could have been lethal to life on this planet.
Right.
Yeah, right.
I think what made me think of that was the movie The Andromeda Strain, which is exactly what happened there. They'd sent a capsule with bacterium up into space to try to mutate it, and it got out of hand.
Right.
That we got a question here that got passed to me, and I believe it's from one of the callers, one of the listeners. That let me try to read it here. It says, "You admit that the U.S. landed Surveyor spacecraft on the moon.
That's right.
Why then couldn't the U.S. land a manned spacecraft?"
Well, there's a big difference, caller or listener, between landing something that is totally mechanical and landing a human being. I've been asked this question many times before because the Russians have landed various mechanical devices, they claim, and we claim we've landed Surveyor, and I'm willing to concede that they did land Surveyor. But here's my point. To take a human being to the moon requires an entirely different technology. In other words, we have to provide for air, for the proper temperature. There are psychological considerations. He's got to be fed. There has to be water. And then, of course, his waste products have to be recycled. The enormity of the problem of getting a human being to the moon and back was studied by the advanced research group at Rocketdyne when I was employed there in the late 50s. And they did a computer study of the difficulty of getting a human being to the moon and back alive, and the chances that they came up with statistically were 0.01 chance in 100. In other words, 1/100th of 1% of a chance to get a human being to the moon and back through all of the different obstacles and hazards and risks that would have existed and do exist.
Perhaps it's a bit soon to get into it, but I'm curious that what about recent developments in the space program, limited though they have been since NASA's budget has been cut to the bone?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. One of my favorite topics now is the fact that the shuttle, which is supposedly going to make its first launch in March, the shuttle is now 2 years behind schedule, and I don't really think that was due to any budgetary cuts. It's due to the fact that technologically it's very, very difficult to get something that's got as many parts as a liquid propellant rocket engine and all the peripheral equipment that goes with it to work successfully, particularly where you're going to expose human beings to risk. And I would like to go back momentarily to the incident in 1967 when Grissom, Chaffee, and White were burned to death in a capsule safely on Pad 34 in Cape Canaveral. In fact, just before Grissom was burned to death, he made the comment, which was tape recorded. He said, you know, they want to send us to the moon, and yet they can't even communicate with us a half a mile away. They were having trouble with the telephone communications between the control center and the command capsule on Pad 34, and Grissom made this comment. And I'd like to elaborate a little bit on Gus Grissom at this point also, is that before he died in this flaming command capsule in January of 1967, Gus Grissom was probably the most outspoken critic of the Apollo project that NASA had. He was beginning to give unauthorized interviews to the press, and this concerned NASA very, very to a great degree. At one point, he hung a lemon on a command capsule, more or less expressing in this figurative way his feeling about the whole Apollo project. And here's the other interesting thing, that Grissom's opinion of Apollo, which was very low, was shared by many of the other astronauts. Walt Schirra once said, if we had as many goofs with Gemini and Mercury as we've had with Apollo, I don't think that this project's going to go. In addition to that, a man by the name of Sam Phillips, who was an Air Force general attached to the NASA project from the Air Force, once submitted a report to President Atwood of North American Aviation in which he stated that he felt that the Apollo project was, quote, literally falling apart at the seams. And this particular report by General Phillips agreed almost, if not word for word, certainly then in thought and content, with the report that Thomas Ronald Barron came up with to submit to Congress. So in other words, Roger, what we have is we have a number of people in the 60s saying that the Apollo project is very, very badly mismanaged, that technologically it's in very, very poor condition. That was certainly borne out by the burning to death of the 3 astronauts, and it was borne out by another incident that has now almost disappeared from NASA records, and that's Apollo Flight 6. All Apollo flights were numbered from 1 through the final Apollo Flight 17. It's very interesting that if you go to the library and you get a book on the Apollo project, that if you try to find Apollo Flight 6, it's very unlikely that you'll find any record of it. It's dropped into what I call an Orwellian memory hole, because Apollo Flight 6 was a total disaster. The second stage didn't light, the vehicle did not go into orbit, and they had to drop it down, by radio command into the ocean, because it would have been a tremendous hazard. It could have fallen on New York City, this flaming meteor. So they got rid of this Apollo vehicle before it did even more damage than it could have. So the point I'm trying to make is that we had a situation where up to Apollo 6, we had, by their own admission, 20,000 logged failures of the Apollo project. But after Apollo 6, and it's a very curious thing that one of the Apollo executives once said, I think what we're going to have to change are procedures. And what I interpret that to mean is that they were going to have to change the reporting of the flights. So by the time Apollo 7 was launched, what we had was total baloney. In other words, Apollo 7 comes across, it was a flight to man rate Apollo, and it comes across as an absolutely perfect flight. Now let me make this point very, very clear, as Nixon would say. If you had an automobile that had ignition trouble and carburation problems, and it was spitting fire out of the exhaust pipe, and the windows weren't working, and it was overheating, and it had just all kinds of problems.
I have one of those.
You've got one of those. Okay. Well, would you, by any stretch of imagination, Roger, imagine that this car would suddenly, overnight, without really any time or energy being spent on it, and I'm talking about the time period, 1967 to 1969, would this entire turkey suddenly cure itself, suddenly become a whole, technically? To me, this is one of the most important points that I think I've ever made in my study of the Apollo hoax, and that is that sometime between Apollo Flight 6 and Apollo Flight 7, there was a complete change in the Apollo project from the standpoint of reporting the information. It seems as though someone took control of Apollo after the death of Grissom, Chafee, and White and said, okay, enough. We're tired of letting the public know what really happened. From now on, we're not going to report any information that is adverse. And by George, they never did. From Apollo 7 flight on, everything went perfect, with one exception. Apollo 13 allegedly failed. And I've discussed this with many people, and the consensus is that because public interest in Apollo was dying after Apollo 11 and 12, they had to put in a ringer. And you'll notice that Apollo Flight 13 failed at the optimum point in its flight where they could get maximum publicity out of this so-called failure of the flight to get to the moon and back. So when you think about it, Roger and listeners, what we're into is that just like our food is supposed to be great stuff and it's actually a weak poison, we're supposed to have the best health care in the world, and yet we rank 37th in longevity. We're supposed to be economically sound, and yet there's no real money in our dollars or our coins. Social Security is bankrupt. In other words, I'm kind of winding up the whole concept of hoaxes here to align it with the moon hoax, is that the government has been expert at lying to the public for decades. I feel at my age that I have been lied to ever since I was a young man. And that's one of the reasons I've become involved, like Mae, with exposing conspiracies and hoaxes, is that I'm trying to get the message across: don't believe the government. Question authority.
Well, it's always been one of my favorite hobbies. I try to question everything possible. Let's see, I had a point. I mentioned earlier that NASA's budget has been cut to the bone, which is why Skylab fell out of the sky. That we simply did not. They thought they felt they knew how to keep it up, but they didn't allocate the money to do so. All right. I assume you are convinced of the reality of the project like Skylab and the space shuttle to come, or is that? Why would they carry the baloney this far, is what I'm saying. They've cut down quite a bit. Why wouldn't they just bail out altogether and drop it?
Well, I think what we have is an organization of some 300,000, 400,000 people that enjoy the high pay and the easy work and the short hours, and they're just trying to keep their project going. When I was involved in aerospace, we used to call it the white-collar WPA. We thought of it as sort of a relief program for the people who couldn't make it in the outside world. And I readily admit that right out of college, I went into aerospace thinking I was going to be a big hero of technology and get involved in some interesting projects, and I simply didn't realize how poorly managed government projects are. That's why after a number of years I bailed out and I've never gone back. But to answer your question, I think that they wanted to perpetuate NASA, so they chose something that had public interest, like the space shuttle, and possible industrial applications, profit-making applications, which would give them corporate support. But now whether the shuttle will work or won't work is still definitely a moot question. We'll know in March or April if and when they launch it. Like many other projects that the government has started, it could be canceled. I was with a program one time for an air-breathing missile that had a lot of money spent on it, and after 4 or 5 years of development, they suddenly canceled it. It was called the Navajo. And they decided that it wasn't going to work, it wasn't going to be any good anyway, and without any to-do, they simply said, okay, that's the end, and they just chopped it. They could do the same thing with a space shuttle. They could have reasons given for canceling it. The government is so expert at lying to the public that they won't have any trouble at all canceling the shuttle with, let's say, quote, acceptable reasons.
All right, we had another comment from, I believe, one of the listeners. What about Alternative 3? I'm
just vaguely familiar with that. I understand the contention of Alternative 3 is that some very wealthy people have set themselves up to bail out of the untenable situation on this planet and to establish themselves a base either on the moon or Mars or somewhere else, or to build a space station. And Alternative 3 being the hypothesis that a few select people will be chosen to leave this planet if and when a great cataclysm occurs, which, we're talking about nuclear war, or maybe the polar ice cap melts and the Earth flips on its axis and the poles become the equator and vice versa. Many things could happen to this planet.
Maybe if we got together and voted in enough people to be sent off into space, we could avoid some sort of cataclysm. We could... Nixon perhaps might be willing for a seat. I don't know.
Well, that's true. We could get rid of some unpleasant people, that's for sure.
Well, we are nearing the end of our time here. I'm I'm curious. Now, I'm a science fiction fan from way back. That I cut my teeth on Isaac Asimov, and I've been to the moon and way beyond a number of times.
Right.
In books, of course. Do you think that we ever will make it? Obviously, you think we haven't so far.
No.
Do you think we will? Do you think we should? Do you think the space program has anything to offer? A space program has anything to offer?
Well, let's see. I'll take those questions in turn. Will we ever go to the moon? I'll say that with the present technology that we have, no. With our policy of granting contracts to the lowest bidder, again, no. With the idea that corporations can just throw money around, waste it, and fool around as they did with projects like the Atlas missile program, there are many reasons why I just don't think that we can be successful technologically doing the things that we are doing the way we are doing them now. If money were turned over to a very dedicated organization that was free of governmental meddling and bureaucratic controls, then possibly we might succeed. The second part of your question, there we get into sort of geopolitics, the sociological aspect. Should we take care of the starving millions on this planet, or should we send men off into the space? Well, having been, a parent and a father to children, my feeling was always, let's take care of the home scene first. In other words, if you've got immediate problems on Earth, you've got people, 1,000 people are dying every day of cancer in the United States. My feeling is that we should concentrate on the things that concern the people of this planet now. Here and now. Do those, because this is analogous to some man whose children are running around barefoot and he's boogieing around in a brand new Rolls Royce. We give this money to big corporations to throw around, to waste on various projects, most of which never come to any good end, and yet we have, I read recently that 50,000 homeless women in advanced years are picking through garbage cans for something to eat in the big cities of America. And I actually saw this the night before last. I was in a little town north of here called Capitola, and there was a woman in tennis shoes and wearing a hat pulled down over her ears, and she had a big paper bag, and she was picking through a trash can, picking out various edible oranges and apples and so forth. So my feeling is, as we wind this up, that the government has actually done us wrong, that we have been lied to, we have been manipulated, they are not to be trusted any further, and that the moon hoax is really just one of many, many hoaxes, just one set of lies that have been inflicted on the American people to their great detriment.
Well, our time is almost come. I've got to sneak this in. All right.
Okay.
That there is a condition that known as osteoporosis, which is the weakening of the bone structure. The bones begin to deteriorate.
I've heard of that.
There is an analogy that they have supposedly encountered with the astronauts, that away from the Earth's gravitational field, they call it astro-osteoporosis. In other words, that the lack of gravity and the lack of exercise causes the same sort of effect in the bones. Now, this is one instance where it may not have brought about a cure, but the application to space travel has pointed out problems and shifted emphasis to these problems, and that maybe that because of this we will have a cure on Earth for osteoporosis, just like we've done tremendous work with communicating with blind and deaf children by trying to teach computers how to talk.
Sure.
We've learned a lot about the speech mechanisms itself, that technology has a lot to teach us.
Oh, definitely. No, I don't discount or dispute with advanced technology at all. It's to our great benefit. My only argument, I only fault big government for, let's say, wasting money that could be spent more suitably, more appropriately for problems close at hand, just as those you've just outlined.
Well, that makes sense. Well, our time is up, and that's it this evening for World Watchers International with our guest star. That Mae Brussell will be back next week to take over the show as regularly planned.
Thank you very much.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.